So this week's episode of Abandoned Sacred Beasts, we get introduced to what will be our second main character that we're going to be following over this story, which is Nancy, who is one of the daughters of one of the soldiers who eventually had to get put down by Hank. With the first episode, it was kind of like the prologue introducing us to this war, which was kind of like a civil war, and just how in a matter of a week, just the tides were turned because of these like godly like creatures that were just devastating that immediately they won the battle, but of course eventually started to lose control because they couldn't revert back to their human form, and how it became this sort of like revenge story of how he kind of got betrayed and now he has to go and hunt down his comrades because that's the deal they made. With this episode, we get the kind of personality and just the overall motivations for Nancy, who is a pretty normal girl, and how she's going to get roped into this situation. And I think they did a really solid job at not only introducing us to Nancy's core personality, understanding that she really is just a normal girl who had a sweet family life. She may not have been the richest kid around, but she did have pretty much everything she needs as long as she had her family. I really enjoyed just learning about her personality and backstory, but most importantly, the thing that kind of stood out the most in this entire episode is noticing that most of these characters acted in a pretty sensible way. Just the way all these characters act, whether it be Nancy, Hank, or just the general villagers from Nancy's town, it felt as if the actions of these characters made logical sense. A lot of times when you have a situation where you have something that clearly is a threat or could potentially be a threat, most of the time, anime stories, they just let the thing play out, where just the bad thing will eventually happen, and then the characters will Pikachu face and be like, wow, I didn't see this coming. In this episode, we're seeing that pretty much all the soldiers who couldn't revert back into their human form, they basically went home, and just, if you kind of see a giant dragon approaching your town, you're probably not gonna fight back against it, at least at first, because, well, that thing could eat you for breakfast without even having to lift a finger. But when you learn that, hey, this is the person who fought for you, and this is your kind of comrade, this is your family, this is your friend, of course, even if it looks like a dragon, I could understand people saying, you know what, the soldiers are saying this is Will, I'm going to believe it's Will. But once things start happening, such as cattle are just completely gone, cows won't just up and leave and just vanish without a trace, and you have a giant dragon living in your basically backyard, of course the natural assumption will be, hey, the dragon's doing this. And my favorite part of this entire episode is how they logically come to the conclusion that the adults potentially can protect themselves, but kids, you can't. If we lose cattle, okay, that's one thing. If we lose our home, that's another thing, but we can't lose the kids. And basically her siblings are forced to leave the town because their father potentially could eat them because he's yelling in the night. He seems like a monster, not like the soldier or just the human that they once knew. And I appreciate that detail. It's a very simple detail throughout this episode, but it kind of represents what the entire cast did, both main and just one and done characters throughout this episode. That the characters actually acted in sensible ways, that they were saying, hey, this is a threat. When you have one of the other soldiers throughout this episode who looks like an ogre, but then when he actually kind of powers up or just kind of completes his form, he becomes the rhino, of course they're going to say, hey, we probably know he's killing people, but what can we say? He's a monster at this point in time. I like how the characters are just acting in a very human way and not in an artificial way. A lot of times anime stories or just manga stories, any stories like this, they will go the route of letting the bad thing happen so an anime fight or something like that could occur. And yes, we get an anime fight in this episode, but they actually allowed characters to act in believable ways, as if we were in reality and we had characters who were, now dragons or now a rhino or something like that, and soldiers are saying, hey, we turned them into this, they just can't revert back, but they are human. Of course, naturally, you're going to say, well, I guess we have to accept them. And then as bad things happen, of course, we're going to naturally push back in ways that hopefully won't harm ourselves. And I appreciate that. It just felt as if there was actually a decent amount of motion throughout this episode, and you felt like all the characters were people throughout this episode. Nancy was a very enjoyable character because I knew she was going to be a character who was going to follow Hank, but how could you justify that? She's a normal farm girl, as we see immediately the episode kicks off. They're talking about tea and just, what they're going to eat for dinner. This is not someone who should be hunting down fallen soldiers. So I was really pleasantly surprised to see the direction they went with Hank, because Hank's someone who's like, okay, I just got shot by this girl, but there's only certain ways that you can kill these soldiers. And he's not gonna, want to bash her head in. It's just a girl who probably he recognizes, oh shit, maybe I did something to offend her. I probably killed her father or something like that. He knows who he's killed, so he's probably made some enemies along the way. And the reason he's clearly going to allow this girl to follow him is because, well, he can't really do much except hurt her to stop her from following him. She does have a gun at the very least, so maybe he can like help her kind of be able to survive this world. But most importantly, this isn't just a random girl, it's his friend's daughter. It's someone that he's had to kill, it's someone that he's really grown to, used to value as a brother, and he kind of probably wants to say, well, if I had to kill him, maybe I can help his daughter, something like that. And for her, she wants to see, is there an actual reason for this, or does this man need to be put down? Because as far as she knows, yes, one of these characters were kind of killing and admitted to killing, but are all of them truly lost? And it's an interesting contrast because clearly the type of bond that they could have, whether it be a positive or a completely negative bond, it'll be pretty fun to follow that because Hank and Nancy are complete polar opposites, and we know Hank has to kill these people because they are ticking time bombs. They'll be more devastating than any war, and as we can see, they all are losing control at different paces, and this is the deal they've made. Just all the characters, they're acting in justifiable reasons. Why a girl would tag along with Hank and why Hank would allow it, it does make sense just based on the connection they had from the war and also her determination to see, is there a reason that her father actually had to be killed and where will her life go after just all of these soldiers are dealt with. It definitely feels as if we're getting a Monster of the Week formula, but it doesn't feel like most Monster of the Week shows. Because for most Monster of the Week shows, what you have is the side character who you get introduced to for that episode. They'll introduce you to their story, and that's how you'll get an emotional connection to the random monster that you will be fighting for that episode. But with Sacred Beast, what we actually have is a reverse where all the monsters that we're fighting are actually connected to our main character, and I actually think it allows for the emotional pull to be a lot tighter, because with episode 1, we did get to know most of these characters on a deep enough level that wasn't the craziest written level ever, but we did understand this squad. We did understand the connection they had. We had enough time of them goofing off, fighting together. It felt as if they were a close group of family, so we do have an emotional connection alongside Hank, and as Hank basically kills them and explores their stories more, we're obviously going to deepen that connection more and more. As we see in this episode where, you had one soldier who, he was a part of a town that was so poor, and his entire drive while fighting in the war was to help them, and now when he's in his monster form, that drive is still what's kind of like making him keep moving forward, but unfortunately because he's now a demon and a beast and just he can't control basically demonic urges, he does things like kill people who just won't give him gold. It's interesting to see just the emotional depth to a monster that we're looking at because we did have a human counterpart at the beginning of episode 1, and by the time we left episode 1, we understood just the personal motivations. I think Sacred Beast is an incredibly fascinating show that basically on the surface level and just seeing what it's doing, you've seen so many stories tell this, but I think the overall execution to this tale is actually pretty unique just because of just the reverse of how they're handling almost the Monster of the Week formula, actually putting it on Hank, who is our central character, so he has a connection to everyone he's fighting, but also just the way they're actually exploring characters in a very human way, not letting them act in a stupid way just so we can have an anime scene, but actually make them act in a very natural way that most mothers, fathers, just general people around them would act put in this situation. Even though this is a very grounded story to reality in terms of the human counterparts, there's a lot of mystical elements to it with the super soldiers and why they were bred for battle, and I think it allows for the show to kind of elevate into an interesting show that, even though it has elements of so many different series that I've witnessed before, it actually feels quite different from the past 2 episodes. I think it was really important that Mappa went the direction of fleshing out the war before we jumped into the story, because that was pretty much anime original that Mappa created so that we could have a connection to Hank, we could have a connection to these soldiers, so it wouldn't just feel like, okay, we're watching a very quiet soldier who seems just emotionless, there's no character there, and he's killing his fallen soldiers. It's kind of interesting, but would I really be that invested? I don't think so. So to have that war and actually see them just before everything went to shit, it was actually the proper direction, which is something I'm not surprised by with Mappa because they know how to flesh out source materials in a very good way that doesn't trample over the original story, but just enhances it so the anime can really flourish, and I think they're doing an excellent job. I thought episode 1 was fantastic, and I think this episode was even a little bit better. Just seeing the actual human just dialogue and just reactions, it felt as if we were watching people, and for being surrounded by demons who are basically just so grotesque, so monstrous, it's pretty fun and just fascinating that we can come out saying this actually feels human even though we're surrounded by so much supernatural just anomalies. And I thought this was a great episode overall. The voice acting was great, the opening and the ending fantastic. Overall, this is a show that could easily be looked over, but I think is one of the stronger series that I've been following throughout this season. I just love everything that I've been reviewing so far this season. It's great. I just think overall we're going to have a fun time with Sacred Beast, but hopefully more people will continue to watch this one because I think this is a fascinating show. But let me know what everyone thought of episode 2. Did you enjoy it as much as myself? Let me know. Be sure to like the video if you did enjoy, and also hit that subscribe button if you have been new. So until next time, everyone, please take care and have a good one.